Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another one of our monthly webinars. We are looking today at growing the youngest minds in a pandemic and what that means for children and families in Oxfordshire. As is normal, we have muted everyone on arrival, so please keep yourself muted so it avoids background noise and interference. As I said just a minute ago, if you can change your display name to your name and your organisation name, then it helps people identify who's in the room. And you should have had an announcement on the way in saying that the webinar is being recorded, and we do make webinars available on our YouTube channel after the event, and sometimes use edited highlights as well to feature things that people have said. So just be aware of that. There is a chat box, of course, so please do use that to say hello, to comment on what the speakers are saying, or to ask questions for the Q&A session we will come to at the end. I'm going to just do a couple of slides by way of introduction to the topic before handing over to people who are far more knowledgeable than me on the subject. So as I say, we are looking at growing the youngest minds in a pandemic, and we've heard a lot over recent months and the last year or so about the impact on children, particularly school-age children. We're thinking today a little bit more about preschool children and some of the impacts there. We know that 1 in 4, 1 in 5 children in Oxfordshire are living in poverty, and that is in what was described in the Telegraph a few days ago as the poshest county in the country, with apparently a flood of Londoners trying to get homes in the Chipping Norton area in particularly. But that wealth does, of course, mask considerable inequality. And the pandemic has, of course, as with pretty much every other area, widened that inequality, and we've seen increasing gaps in terms of more people accessing food banks and community larders, and an increase in the early years development gap within the county and nationally. And I think the early years are something of a hidden need. Since children's centres were closed, funding for early years has been very low. Through the pandemic, very young babies will have been born at home and not been passed hand to hand and not seen out and about in quite the same way. So I think it's quite a tricky area to understand what the impacts have been and to think about. But I look forward to hearing what our expert speakers have to say later on today. The next slide, it may be too late if you haven't already heard about this, but we have had a funding round open. It's due to close tomorrow. So if you haven't yet got an application in, if you get your skates on, you can probably get something in. And that is focused on the pandemic and the impacts on children and families, and trying to help families recover from those negative impacts across a whole range of fronts. So that's it from me, but the speakers we have today, we're delighted to have a very distinguished array of speakers. So in a moment, I'll be handing over to Dr. Nayeli Gonzalez, who is Senior Lecturer in Psychology at Oxford Brookes University and involved with the Babylab they have there. And then we'll be handing over to Catherine Barber, who's Chief Exec at Home Start Oxford and has also co-founded the Oxford Early Years Network. I think it might be the Oxfordshire Early Years Network, actually, I'm not sure. And then finally, we will be hearing from Laura Barber, who has been working for many years at the Sutton Trust, looking at early years and some of the evidence and information around what works there. And then, of course, we will, as usual, have time for Q&A at the end. So thank you again for turning out. And I will now hand over to Nayeli, who will speak to us about her work. Thank you. Are you unmuted? Yes, you are. Not sure we can hear you, Nayeli.
Okay. Nayeli was having some problems with her sound before we started. Nayeli, do you want to stop screen sharing so we can see you and figure out what's going on? So I think Nayeli has left the meeting to come back in. That seems to have fixed it before.
Okay.
So let's just bear with her and we'll let her straight back in as soon as she comes back into the waiting room.
Catherine, can you answer my question? Is it the Oxford Early Years Network or is it the Oxfordshire Early Years Network?
Oxfordshire, yes.
It is, yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, excellent.
Okay.
Welcome
perfect.
back, Nayeli.
Sorry about that. I don't
That's
know.
all right. No, it's surprisingly rare for us to have technical problems, but these things do happen. So over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I was just saying that Alexandra, Hendry, and myself, we are here today, and this work is in collaboration with Catherine Davies, Dora Gliga, and Michelle McGillian as well. So the social distancing and development study is just trying to understand how lockdown affected cognitive development, and more specifically, we look at two key aspects of infants' early cognitive development. On one side, we have language development, and the other side, we have executive functions. And we want to explore whether any effects might be moderated by factors such as parental interactions, also just parental mental health, child sleep, the activities that parents were doing during lockdown with their children, and also screen use and socioeconomic status. Just very briefly, to tell you about executive functions, researchers have identified two dissociable executive function components in young children. On one hand, we have cognitive executive functions that are the skills that enable us to focus our attention, think flexibly to solve problems, and return to what we were doing after a distraction. And we'll be referring to these as thinking skills.
I think we've lost your sound again, Nayeli.
Nayeli, I am here if you need me to take over. So just I can either run with some slides that I've got or run yours if you can email them to me. So should we just give Nayeli a second to drop in and out and then?
Yes,
yeah.
You should be able to see the slides, Alex, as an attendee. So if you want to try talking to them while Nayeli comes.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So I can talk through the executive functions in particular because that's what's up on the slide. So we're talking about, on the one hand, these cognitive thinking skills. So being able to control our attention, being able to think flexibly, being able to hold multiple ideas in mind, so working memory. And then on the other hand, we've got what we kind of sometimes call hot executive functions or regulatory executive functions. And that's the ability to control our impulses and manage our own emotions. Okay, so Nayeli, if you're hearing this,
Can you hear me now?
Yay!
Okay, I don't know what's happening with my sound. Somebody's just, yeah. So Alex explained pretty well what executive functions are, and then in terms of the methodology that we use, so we started testing families with 8 to 36-month-olds and the first lockdown. So that was at the beginning, in the middle, at the end of that lockdown, then during the winter lockdown in November, and then we just finished data collection a couple of weeks ago for the third lockdown. And the kind of questions that we asked to parents, so it was a whole range of things that we were asking about. So demographic information about their language development, their executive functions, as we mentioned, the kind of activities that they were doing during lockdown, parental mental health. And we also asked parents to record some videos of them playing with their parents.
We've lost you again. This is really frustrating.
Okay, so I'll step in briefly while we work this out. Okay, so the results that we're going to be sharing, these are, some of them have been submitted, but a lot of them are work in progress. So normally the convention is it goes through a process of peer review where other scientists will look at it. So please do bear in mind that whilst the data are the data, we haven't been completely scrutinized by other scientists yet. Nayeli, are you there? No. Okay, do you want to carry on with the next slide and I'll try and talk through that?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Third time lucky. Yes, let's carry on speaking and fingers crossed.
Okay. What were babies doing during lockdown? What we found is...
No, I don't know what's happening. There's a horrible hissing noise and then it just disappears.
I would suggest that maybe if Nayeli and Alex don't mind, if Alex could carry on and Nayeli could move the slides through. Otherwise, Alex, I do have a copy of the slides as well that I can project for you to work through them. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I'll do my best. Okay, so one of the things we've been looking at is what have actually families been doing during the lockdown. So we asked them to report on the time that they were spending both pre-lockdown and then during each lockdown at the 3 time points that Nayeli mentioned. So go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. Okay, and of course, as I think we're all expecting, we saw a stark increase in screen time kind of across the board. Okay, so one of the analyses we ran was we looked at kind of whether socioeconomic status, and our markers of that were parental education, parental occupation, income, and neighbourhood deprivation, whether this kind of socioeconomic status was linked to the different activities that were going on in the home. And during the spring lockdown, lower SES was linked with fewer enriching activities. So that is to say that the more advantaged families, babies from the more advantaged families, were engaging in more enriching activities with their parents. Now, interestingly, we didn't find that association before lockdown, and we didn't find that association in the winter lockdown. So there seemed to be something specifically going on during the spring lockdown. And when we kind of dug into our data, what we found was that this effect was being driven by 3 things in particular: by activities involving access to books, by activities involving outdoor space like exercise and gardening. And of course, during that first spring lockdown, libraries were closed and we weren't able to go out very much. And indeed, even some playgrounds, most playgrounds were shut. So if you didn't have access to private space, you couldn't engage in those enriching activities. So what we're suggesting there is that the particularly strict lockdown of spring 2020 disproportionately disadvantaged lower income families. Go ahead, Nayeli. Okay. We also looked at, so someone's asked, what does SES stand for? Socioeconomic status. So obviously it's a very complex construct, but we're looking at, you know, this mix of parental education alongside income and just access to resources, really. So then we've looked at what is the association between activities and language growth. So here I'm going to see if Nayeli's mic's back up, because this is really hard.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So we found that during lockdown, the time.
No, we've lost you again, Nayeli.
Yeah.
A second or 2 and then goes.
No. Okay.
Can you
so
hear me now? I changed microphone now.
We've got you.
Okay. So, but not before. It was related to language production. So the amount of words that children were producing. So the more they spend doing these activities, then the greater the vocabulary will be. And also the activities, enriching activities during lockdown were linked with expressive language growth, where reading and speaking one-to-one, indoor exercise, and arts and crafts. And all of these activities are very rich in terms of language. We also asked them, as I said, just about parental interactions. And to do that, we just use parental sensitivity. That means just the ability for parents to correctly interpret and respond appropriately to infant signals, or the way that they tune in to the infant. And a parent that is very good in tuning into the infant then will have a baby with better expressive vocabulary, better vocabulary. And also what we found is that parents that are very tuned in, they will do many more different enriching activities. So it's not about the amount of time that they spend doing these activities, it's about the number of activities that they do. In terms of executive functions, what we found is that we showed that more enriching activities that parents engage in with their babies and toddlers, the stronger their child's thinking skills will be. And then we also show that high use of TV and touchscreen devices by children during lockdown was associated with weaker thinking and emotion regulation skills. So probably these findings don't really surprise you, but what is important is that we've demonstrated that it is the case, as most evidence for the benefits of enriching activities and also the risk of screen use come from research with older children. So this study really helps to make the case that what happens in the home in the first 3 years of life does matter for early cognitive development. In terms of early childhood education and care and their links with language and executive functions, we found first social gradients in childcare attendance during the pandemic. So children from higher socioeconomic status attended early childhood education and care more often than children from lower socioeconomic status families. And we found that the more exposure to nurseries and childminders during the pandemic was associated with greater increases in receptive vocabulary, so language comprehension. And this was specific for children from less advantaged backgrounds. So children from less advantaged backgrounds who continued to attend childcare during the pandemic showed stronger improvements in language skills. And growth of thinking skill was boosted by nursery and childminder attendance during the period, regardless of the socioeconomic background. So that was true for everyone. So our findings really highlight the importance of high quality early childhood education for the development of key skills and for leveling socioeconomic inequalities. And our study really is suggesting that attending early childhood education and care really does matter for early cognitive development. So how can we support parents to help children to thrive? We think that based on our data so far, it boils down to 3 different things. One is to inform parents. The second one is to reduce barriers. And the third one is to provide families with options. And I'm just gonna very briefly talk about this. So we suggest that to help children to develop their key cognitive language and emotion regulation skills that they need to thrive, academics, early year practitioners, and policymakers, we need to work together so that we can, on the one hand, spread the message that playing, talking, singing with your child really does make a difference. Also, we need to increase awareness of the risk associated with high screen use in early childhood. And we think that policymakers need to, one, ensure that access to communal resources such as libraries and playgroups are only restricted as last resort in the event of future lockdowns. And we also think that they need to increase funding and legislative support for paid parental leave so that parents have the opportunity to spend quality time doing enriching activities with their children. And we also think that increased funding is needed for community groups because they are really good. They play a big role to support the parent-child relationship, and they offer affordable parent-child activities that we know, based on our results, that are very important. And finally, we think that that we need also to increase funding for early childhood education and care. So it's not that is just childcare, so they are not childcare providers. They provide high quality education, and we need also to put measures to encourage take-up, especially for children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. So as we said, this is very much work in progress, and then we are working on putting all of this together and looking also into the long-term effects of the pandemic. So thank you very much. Apologies for all the technical issues. And I would like also to thank the families that took part in our study, our funders, and so here you have our details, both Alex's and mine, and also the website of the project if you are interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Nayeli, and thank you, Alex, for stepping into the breach. And well done for soldiering through the technical problems there. And I think you're able to stick around because I think there's been a lot of comments in the chat, and I'm sure there will be questions later for what sounds like a very interesting piece of work. And I'd have to say a pretty ringing endorsement of the existence and activities of Home Start. So that leads very nicely into Catherine Barber. Welcome, Catherine. And do you want to start by introducing yourself and just outlining briefly what it is that Home Start does?
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Adrian. So Home Start Oxford is part of a wider Home Start network across the UK, and we provide holistic support for families who are facing a really wide range of difficulties when their children are in their earliest years. So we provide emotional and practical support that's delivered by volunteers, one-to-one, and also offer group sessions. So we're really about celebrating a parent's strengths, helping them to widen their connections in the community, so that they can grow in confidence and resilience and give their children the best start in life.
Thank you. And I mean, this has been a topic of conversation in my team because we've had 2 people having babies over the last year. But what's it been like for parents having their first baby in lockdown?
Well, massively tough, I think, and there's a few examples that we give. So if you're having your first baby, you might expect to meet new friends through baby groups in the community. You'd be seeing friends and family. You'd expect support from a health visitor coming to your home, and all of those have been undermined by lockdown, either taken away completely or really limited. There hasn't been that easy access to health visitors or GPs that we're normally used to. And one of the things that I think is really stark is that we've seen a real discrepancy between paid provisions. So groups operating commercially, whether it's Monkey Music or a session like that, have often found ways to make it work online, or to, because it's their business, they've been able to get back up and running as quickly as possible. And it's been more challenging for voluntary groups who might be reliant on a church premises that's no longer available. They may be relying on volunteers who were vulnerable and couldn't volunteer anymore. So there's been a real loss, and I think a particularly acute loss for those services that were free or low cost for families in communities around Oxfordshire. So that means there's been a really big gap in early childhood experiences, all of those enriching experiences about observing conversation, seeing strangers, getting out and about in the world, that are all part of a child's early learning and development. Yeah, so we've got one mum in particular that one of our coordinators has been working with as part of the Growing Minds project, who we've seen really struggling with confidence, anxiety really through the roof about getting out of the house, having not left with their baby, very much until they're sort of now about 5 months old. And crossing the roads become a really scary experience, because they're not used to navigating the streets with their buggy. Anxiety about whether a car will come whilst crossing the road. So just, really practical examples of how that anxiety can manifest to still be limiting experiences now, as we're getting more out and about.
Thank you. It sounds like what can be a very isolating time is even more so because of lockdown and the lack of ability to connect with other people in the local community. I know I'm sure you've got lots of very powerful stories of work you've done, but I think there's one in particular through the Playful project that you wanted to share today.
Yeah, great. So Growing Minds is a project we're really, really proud to be part of. And one of the big challenges starting that during lockdown was that the big focus was about making relationships with parents in the community, for us in Littlemore, but also in Berensfield as part of the project. In southern Oxfordshire, and so the challenge was to make those relationships, and we had to forge those relationships with much reduced tools. Normally we'd have been expected to be out in the community seeing people and offering sessions and meeting up face to face. So it was really important to establish that trust and engagement, and particularly trying to reach the parents that may be least likely to engage with us. So there's one example. Playful was something that was initiated in the autumn last year, and it was offering food that was delivered to families every week. And Lucy, our coordinator, was recording a video of herself in her home with her own children preparing food to share with people through a WhatsApp group and on a Zoom session to talk about their experiences. And this provided a way to introduce topics from the Peak Learning Together programme that we use to provide early learning experiences, but also introduce those concepts around the importance of language and communication that Nayeli talked about. And there's one mum, Lucy, was really particularly attuned to those parents that weren't responding to phone calls or texts, that might be the ones that are feeling lower. And there was one particular mum who sort of was in that category, if you like, that wasn't easily engaging with us. But once that relationship started to develop, she disclosed long-standing substance abuse difficulties, and that was built on lots of difficult early childhood experiences that had really stifled her adult life. So she absolutely loved playing with her kids, and it was a really good distraction for her, actually, from her substance abuse challenges. But her own experiences at play as a child had been really limited, so she'd not had that experience of creative play particularly, and for her the association of play was something that you'd buy from a shop. So having established really great engagement through Playful, and this project that ran for several weeks, offering food and involving the children in that experience of eating and sharing food and conversation together, there was a real turning point. And the mum was really sort of lapped up all the opportunities we could offer. So, for example, Lucy delivered activity mats, which I think Kate can share on the screen for people to see. So really simple, free ideas that you can do at home with stuff you've got around the house. The idea of treasure baskets, so again, simple home objects that you can use to play. Brought in ideas from an approach called Watch, Wait and Wonder, which is a course that OXPIP offer, to really sort of lead from the cues from your baby or young child, and appreciate that there's a lot of opportunity and learning potential in play that just happens between you and your baby. You don't need expensive resources, and we've really seen mum flourish and, you know, open up and share her difficulties that she hadn't disclosed with other agencies. She was really fearful of her children being taken away, and that's something we see across the spectrum. Those huge barriers that Nayeli and Alex talked about, that make people very fearful for reaching out for help. But actually, by sharing and supporting her to see that her disclosures, if you like, were a sign of real strength and positivity, she's opened up to us and other professionals that are in her life through the school, for example, and just seeing her you know, really progress very well, and brilliant changes for her children as well. So whereas her older child was kind of hyper vigilant, seeing that her behaviours calming down, she's more focused in class, and for the younger child whose language development wasn't quite where it might have been expected, now drawing more, using their toys more creatively, and much more language development coming forward.
That sounds wonderful, and it's good to hear a plug for Watch, Wait and Wonder at OXPIP. As those of you who don't know, I used to work at OXPIP, and it's a very wonderful organisation, and their training is well worth getting on if you have a chance. Finally, then, we mentioned the Early Years Network, and it'd be good to hear about what that's doing and why it came about.
Yeah, fantastic. So this is something I'm really proud to have started with Charlotte Pearson-Miles from the charity Viva Doorsteps. And we were both part of Oxfordshire's Children and Young People's Forum, but we're really concerned that there weren't as many participants from early years groups as we'd like, I think due to time and travel factors. And so we started this online during lockdown. It also coincided with the end of the County Council's funding for former children's centres and the loss of workers that have been supporting groups that had managed to carry on in the summer last year. So we've got this as an online network and regular emails and Zoom meetings that we have, and we've got about 150 people signed up from community-based toddler groups, former children's centres and church-based stay and plays. And so it's really a peer support network where we're sharing best practice, helping to show how groups are working within the guidelines to offer as much as possible and overcoming some of those challenges around volunteers or responding to the stresses or strains that we're seeing amongst families, supporting ourselves as workers, but also trying to focus on that outreach so that how can we reach those parents that aren't reaching out for help. And we've taken it to another stage in working with the County Council to really advocate for greater focus on under fives. So we're taking part in a deep dive on data to improve the sort of visibility of data, particularly relating to the under fives, whether it's about experience of domestic abuse or maternal mental health, so that across different systems, if you like, we're all increasing our focus for much bigger impact for the youngest children.
Well, good luck at the start. It's a hugely underfunded area, and it's good that people are advocating for greater resources in that area. Thank you, Catherine. Please do stick around. I can see the chat is lively. I'm not actually reading any of the comments, but I'm sure there will be questions and comments to pick up on later if we have time. So our final interviewee speaker, Laura Barber from the Sutton Trust. Welcome, Laura. Do you want to just kick off and introduce yourself and the Sutton Trust briefly? You're still muted.
There we go. Yeah, so I'm Laura Barber from the Sutton Trust, and the Trust was established in '97 by Sir Peter Lample to increase equality of opportunity for young people. And I've sort of had the honour really of being at the Trust since the very beginning, and I've had a kind of variety of roles there, but I've really kind of focused for the last, probably 10 years or so, really focused on the early years. And the Trust sort of campaigns for social mobility from birth right through to the workplace, so that really every child and young person, no matter their start in life, what school they go to, where they live, have a kind of equal chance of success. And the Trust does this through kind of a slightly unique, we think, sort of blend of research, support for programme delivery, but also policy advocacy.
Excellent. And can you tell us a bit more about the focus the Sutton Trust has on early years and what that means in practice?
Yes, of course. So the Trust sort of really believes that if you want to truly kind of level the playing field in terms of opportunities and life chances, you really need to start supporting children and families from birth. And in fact, our journey kind of focusing on the early years did start right at the beginning. And it was actually here, where you are in Oxford, when in '97, we were invited to visit what was then the PEEP project, which I know has already been referred to, and now known as People, and of course based in Cowley on the site of what was then Piers, now the Oxford Academy. And at the time, the Sutton Trust had really just started to support projects which aimed to widen access to highly selective universities. And our entire focus at the time was on young people aged 16 plus. But that visit, kind of seeing, families and children learning together, really opened our eyes to the vital importance of the first years of life. And I think it's fair to say, I think our first grant was to PEEP. And from then on, we've continued to develop our interest in and support for the sector, both in terms of research, but also grassroots delivery. And of course, the kind of last 20 years has seen a kind of real growing body of evidence supporting the importance of the early years. I mean, notably in this country, I guess there's the EPI project, which identified and tracked the impact of the early years on children right through to 18. But the Sutton Trust has commissioned a number of papers as well, one which kind of identified that there can be nearly a year's development gap between children from lowest incomes families and their more affluent peers by the time they reach school age. But I think the thing that we kind of continue to emphasize, which is really the most important, is that is not a foregone conclusion, and that there are always ways of addressing this gap.
Thank you. And I mean, we all know that working in the early years has an incredibly long lead time in terms of the potential impacts and benefits. And how do you therefore decide where to focus your attention and work in order to maximize potential impact?
Yes. Well, as I sort of said, we kind of work across the age range, from birth right through to access to the workplace, and we have a similar approach, across the board, which is, in the first instance, to almost act on what you might be described as a hunch. I mean, and I say a hunch, but that is always, I hope, well informed by the sector. But if there's not existing robust evidence available, then what we will do is kind of commission that research to kind of build the case, accessing sort of available data. And then if we do get sufficient evidence, we then kind of look, right, how do we address this issue? Both by kind of supporting delivery at grassroots level, I think, and then going through to influencing policy. And I think one of the things that I feel most strongly about the work of the Trust is it's one thing to kind of slightly sit back and say, this is what should be done, this will help. But it's not until you really kind of get involved in the delivery that you realise what the real challenges are. So we've sort of sometimes named ourselves a do tank as well as a kind of think tank. And I do think that is kind of one of the most important elements. But just to kind of give you an example, so we commissioned a report which looked into examined the Millennium cohort data, for example, and it was particularly looking to identify any strongly emerging patterns in the early years. And, as already has been mentioned, in our kind of keynote speech here, it reinforced the existing messages around both the importance of the home learning environment and, of course, then the potential mitigating role that can be played by high quality early education settings. So that we kind of have the research, we've got the data, this influenced two kind of big tranches of work for the Sutton Trust. The first kind of focused on supporting existing parental engagement interventions, including PEEP and an app called Easy Peasy, which you might have come across, which is a kind of smartphone-based app which kind of gives game ideas to parents to kind of play with their children, learning developmental games. And what we did in that case is we invested in external evaluation to really help the organisations develop their evidence base, which then enabled them to scale up and access further funding, both for kind of developing their service, increasing, the impact data, but also kind of scaling up and rolling out delivery. And then the second tranche is, as I said, on the kind of high quality early years setting. That's kind of a piece of work that's ongoing for us. And we call it CECIL, which is coaching early conversations, interaction and language. And it's all about CPD, continuous professional development, and really ongoing support for high quality practice within early years settings. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And the inevitable question that we have for everybody pretty much we can't have on is how has all of that been affected by the pandemic over the last 15 months or so? Well, I mean, the Sutton Trust is not a kind of traditional kind of grant funder anymore. We might have been a little bit when we started, but so we weren't in a position to kind of to have the resources to switch to kind of immediate, to sort of solve immediate funding crisis. From our perspective, we were in the middle of the CECIL project we're just starting the CECIL project that I've mentioned. In fact, we kind of launched it just at the beginning of the first lockdown, and we were working with 2 speech and language therapy teams who were kind of providing CPD in private and voluntary early years settings. And of course, they couldn't, the settings had to close in the first lockdown, so everything had to be on hold. And then when it started up in September, no one external was allowed into the settings. And so what happened? Everything had to pivot to online. We were able to support, because of course it led to additional costs, and we were able to support the delivery teams to do that, and they were incredibly resourceful in pivoting to digital delivery. We kind of decided, well, we're going to have to use this as an opportunity to see, what are the positives about digital versus kind of face-to-face. And there was some useful learning, and they managed to kind of keep going. But as I'm sure a lot of you will have found, and as we're all saying the same thing here, we managed to keep going, but we certainly lost a lot by not being able to have the face-to-face delivery, and particularly when it came to kind of establishing relationships between kind of trainers and practitioners. So, we did learn some lessons. We did manage to get through it, but it wasn't ideal, as I think we all know. And then I think from a research perspective, I'd say that that was one area where we did kind of immediately kind of shift our planned research agenda and sort of set that aside, and immediately we went to kind of starting to track in real time sort of impact on children and families, and in particular settings in the early years, and that kind of led to a publication last, I think, June 20 on the impact of COVID on the early years, and has already been sort of well discussed here, and of course well documented. It's sadly no surprise that it was those families who living in the most challenging circumstances, of course, who were the most negatively affected. And it was the settings in those areas which were kind of the greatest risk in terms of their survival. And, as we've seen, I mean, we've already been kind of working with Alex and talking about, their very useful report. And, it's clear the data is already emerging regarding the immediate and medium impact of the pandemic on children and their families, pointing to kind of the, exacerbating, what was already perhaps in place. And I suppose the final thing is just to say that, unfortunately, I think we see the pandemic has provided a kind of real life experiment that really clearly demonstrates the importance of support for families and children in the early years, and for all the reasons already been discussed. It's long been a priority for the Sutton Trust, but I think now is the time when we are really kind of upping our level of active campaigning in the hope of having some impact on policy, because it's so clear that if support is not implemented quickly, there may not be adequate services in place for children and families, even as they emerge from the pandemic. Thank you, Laura. Really, really interesting and really good to hear about all the work you're doing. We are amazingly ahead of time. I don't think that's ever happened before. So congratulations to our speakers for how concise you've been. But Kate, do we have some questions or comments from the chat you want to pick up?
Yes. So the first question, I think perhaps we should direct this towards Catherine, was from Carol Stavris about access to help. So she's talking about 3 children's centres that existed in Didcot that were taken away in austerity cuts. Now that these services are being offered by the voluntary and charitable sector, which is dependent on volunteer capacity, how can families in need be guaranteed help when it's needed?
Do you want me to head on for that?
Yes,
right. Carol, I mean, I'm coming at it from really a similar perspective as you as a charitable organisation, with the same kind of pressures around funding and volunteer availability. I think one of my thoughts, having had some meetings on the back of the creation of our early years network with the Director of Children's Services, who I think was new in post last year, is our sense is that he does understand that the County Council is spending a lot of money on the highest level of social care, and we were quite heartened by his commitment to try and, I think he termed it, move money downstream. So that may be about taking big difficult decisions about reprioritising early years support, which we really hope will come to fruition, and we'll keep advocating for that. I think the other part of the picture for me is that it's reaching families that won't hear about our services through social media or other means, or maybe lack the confidence to access the kind of support that you and we are offering. And for that, the role of the health visitors is so crucial. And so I think part of ensuring universal access to support that is available is about making sure that health visitors are still meeting every family and having a sufficient relationship to be able to suggest and encourage them to access the support that is there. Obviously, the kind of million-dollar question is having the money to be able to continue the kind of support that we're providing. But alongside that, in terms of volunteer capacity, I think if I was asked kind of what were my kind of 3 top asks for the sector to make things better, one would be encouraging people to come forward as volunteers, and making those kind of opportunities available through the Oxfordshire website, so that we can attract new people to the sector and support them to play a role.
Hello, can I just chip in here, because I'm chair of a new community partnership organisation that we've just set up in Didcot, which is doing intending to do, we're just getting started with some funding, quite a lot of the things that we're talking about today. And we've come about very much because there has been so much feedback on the lack of support since all the children's centres in Didcot were closed. It's taken Didcot a bit longer than some of the other local towns to get going on this, partly because there's so much growing need that you're kind of trying to work out how you can possibly establish something that would help. But we are definitely getting there now, and we're hoping to include partnerships with everybody in sight around Didcot, because it is such a growing town, such an enormous population, that we really need to start sort of really building the community from the bottom up again, and also put in place so much of what we're talking about today. And people like Home Start, we really appreciate what they're doing, and we're hoping to partner up with all sorts of people similar to what they're doing.
Thank you, Ali. That's really good to hear, because as you say, I mean, Didcot sadly lost all of its children's centres, and it's good to know that things are restarting. Do put your contact details in the chat so people can reach out to you if they want to know more or be involved.
Can I follow from that, please?
Yes, please do.
I'm Wantage and Grove, and we've had 7,000 new houses, and we have lost practically all our preschools except 3, purely because a lot of them are being moved into the schools. That's fine, but they're taking less numbers than our preschools were taking. They're taking about 20 children. Most of our preschools were taking 30 to 35 children. I'm in the position now, I'm exceedingly old. I'm in my 80s. I've worked in preschools, well, for yonks, and I'm trying to help them, one of our preschools, to get a new building so that they can take at least 40 to 45 children. We have, with our Schedule 106 money, we have £50,000 in our hands. and we can get help from nobody. Nobody's interested. And, you know, it's very nice to hear about all these projects, but what's going to happen to all these children when all these children are coming into the area and we're not getting any help?
And sorry, could you just say who you are and
I'm
Joyce
Hutchinson.
Right.
I've been a supervisor. I've started playgroups. I've supported them when I was a chairman of the Vale White Horse District Council. And now I support one particular playgroup, which is Camel Preschool. At the moment, my biggest thing is fighting the county council.
And what is it you are trying to do that is the struggle?
We are in a terrapin, which is now beginning to leak. We want to build a new building. We have £50,000 towards this, but we can't get any help from the county council to say whether we can build on the school site, on the site that we're on. We're looking for some land in the area because we want to keep our same catchment area. And we are now into our 5th year looking for this.
Well, you have my sympathies, and there's a lot of people around in the room, some of whom may be able to offer you some advice and support. If my contact details will go up later, if you want to ping me a line, we can have a think about whether we can do anything to support or signpost. It's not an area of expertise for us organisationally, but we may be able to connect you up with someone. So please do reach out.
I think basically I want people to realise that the preschools are disappearing.
Okay, thank you for that. Kate.
Yeah, we've got another question from Prue from Home Start. Has there been any specific focus on families who speak English as an additional language? I didn't know whether Laura or perhaps Catherine or even our researchers might have some insights into that. The question is about English as an additional language.
In terms of our project, so one of the things that we are looking, so one of the bits of the project is looking at bilingual children, so children that were exposed to other languages during lockdown and how that changed the dynamics, so that suddenly maybe children that the whole household was in a different language, then that meant that during lockdown they lost all the exposure to English, for example. So then we are looking at those sorts of effects. Yeah, we haven't analyzed that data fully just now.
Catherine or Laura, anything to add on that?
No, just, I mean, as Nayeli's already said, I mean, obviously communication and language has been one of the things that's come out most strongly in terms of where the negative impact's been seen across the board. And when we did our research, it was interesting. So when you asked families and parents, what they would be saying would be the sort of social emotional development of their children that they were most concerned about. But then when it kind of got into looking at it in terms of in reception classes, where they felt the kind of biggest gaps was in communication and language. I mean, and social emotional, but it was the strongest negative was being seen in the communication and language. So one imagines that's the same if you're exactly in a bilingual family.
Thank you.
And we've got another sort of a more practical question, perhaps. Sorry, my unmuting failed there. I'm just going to try again. Yeah, so I wonder if Catherine might want to invite Lucy to answer this one. What about new babies where the family was also coping with homeschooling for older siblings?
So this was something that was quite interesting when working through the sort of first lockdown as part of the Growing Minds project, was that my sort of first couple of months of support went to families who I don't expect that I'd normally support, who were kind of quite financially stable, but having older children and then babies at home and still trying to work from home meant that they were having to kind of lean on those support networks. So I definitely saw that we supported a lot of families who had older children and who were also working from home during that period. And again, whether that was just providing kind of play ideas, kind of talking about how you could structure your time so that you felt you didn't have that kind of huge overwhelming mother's guilt that you hadn't done this and you hadn't done that. So yeah, kind of talking about structures of day was the day and things like that were things that we were able to do to support families in that position.
Thank you.
I've got another question for Alex and Nayeli about their research from Gita Lobo. Will your research be a longitudinal study, and will it be looking at long-term effects of the pandemic?
Yeah, Gita, so that's a very, very important question. And then we wonder also about what the long-term effects are. So that's why we have been following up this cohort. So then during the November lockdown, so that's 6 months after the first lockdown. And we just finished data collection for 1 year after the first lockdown. So we are looking at the longer term effects of that, but we haven't analyzed the 1 year data just yet. So we just finished a couple of weeks ago. But yeah, that's a very important question.
Thank you. Well, we may have to ask you back in another year or so to feed back on the longer term findings. Anything else, Kate, from the chat?
Yeah, I've got several more questions if we've got time. I think we have. So Sarah Buxton has commented, I did my social work training in 1991 to 93 when the importance of early years support was already very well recognised. How can we overcome the frightening delays in financial support going to this sector, which is vital for society as a whole?
Not an easy one. Anyone want to?
Sure, I'll have a go. I mean, I'm just kind of I think this is something. I mean, it was interesting when the Royal Foundation, you probably saw, put out results of the big parent survey they did before. I think it was published in December, and I think it was a kind of reasonably self-selecting group, wasn't it? I think of about 500,000 people who still, even from a reasonably self-selecting group, it was only 25% of that group saw the early years as kind of really the most important, really educational, sort of developmental phase. And I think that kind of gives us a sort of sense of, some of the challenges. If we're going to influence policy, I think before we get to that, it's almost as if we need for society as a whole to recognise it as the importance of the early years. And there's certainly, I think so early years funders, it's one of the key things that we're kind of coming together to try and think about. How do you inform people, how do you take the research and kind of turn it into a message that people really kind of relate to and understand.
Thank you, Laura. Kate.
A final question, I think, for Laura again. We've had a query about your progress on, actually this is kind of the same question, isn't it? Your progress on policy change and advocacy in terms of the early years. I think that's actually the same question, isn't it? Did you have anything further to say on that, Laura? Sorry.
Not really. I think it's sort of it's kind of feels like you've got to kind of come at it from all different angles as a
yeah. Okay, so another question just popped up. So the UK is now on the UN's child poverty watch lists. Redistribution of wealth across communities is needed. What do people think about a universal income model? That's another very big question. People might want to share their views on that before we close.
I think that's maybe a political question beyond the scope of the early years. I mean, I think it is. They're looking at piloting it in parts of Wales, aren't they? So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But if it can be made to work, I think it might be a very, very interesting model. We probably need to draw the conversations to a close there, but thank you very much to all our speakers, to Nayeli and Alex for stepping in so ably, to Catherine and to Laura for some very thoughtful contributions around the early years, and thank you to everyone who's contributed through the chat. We will share the chat and some feedback through email, and it's always good to have a lively discussion going alongside. I think we've got up to 92 people today, so we've got, again, a really good turnout. My details or the means to book a 30-minute slot with me are in the chat box. I've been having really interesting conversations with all sorts of people from across the sector locally. If you want to have a chat, then please click on the link and book a slot, and I'll be very, very happy to say hello. And we look forward to seeing you back here in just under a month on the 21st of July at 2 o'clock again, when we are delighted to be hosting Imam Manawar Hussain, the first Muslim High Sheriff of Oxfordshire. The High Sheriff of Oxfordshire, one of the oldest appointed positions in the country. My favourite fact is the first High Sheriff of Oxfordshire was Seawold in 1066. So Manawar Hussain is following in a very, very long line of history there. But he is going to come and talk to us about celebrating the heroes of Oxfordshire, and we will be hearing from some people who have been nominated for High Sheriff Awards and some of the work Manawar has been doing over the last 15 months or so to support communities locally. So it's going to be very interesting, and I suspect quite a moving session with Manawar. So look forward to seeing you all back here then. In the meantime, where I am now in Littlemore, the sun is now shining, so it's a slightly brighter day, and I hope the rest of your day goes well. And thank you again for turning out, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.